So it is that brief period, which, as I said, actually was subverted by the creators very fast. I mean, Flash subverted this in 1958. I mean, the Comics Code Authority only came in 1954, and the Fantastic Four appear in 1961, which basically take that tendency toward naturalism and personal doubt and stuff like that, and just all of a sudden we are looking at a whole new form of literature, really. And at this time, uh, the adolescents of the late 50s felt very strongly about this. And the term golden age of comics was actually created by a comics fan. Actually turned out to be a famous science fiction writer later. And it appeared in a fanzine. Now, oddly enough, it didn't really catch on and shows up in weird places like a blurb. There's actually, when Captain America is revived as a character, it's actually Marvel who says, from the golden age of comics, without any specification of what that really means. There was no implication. In fact, if anything, I mean, the Captain America comics were no joke in terms of body counts and war stuff. So the point being that the phrase was kicking around and vaguely associated with those older comics. But when people started using it by the late 60s and early 70s, and particularly in 1971, when people started using it as having an identity as certain comics content, they were nostalgizing 1956. They were nostalgizing when they were 12 and reading, these goofy, fun, superhero comics. And actually, frankly, they weren't actually all that fun. They were pretty bland. The 40s were really whimsical for Captain Marvel, Superman, and all kinds of other characters. Very science fiction-y. Oh, and science fiction came back in 1958 as well, when Otto Binder, in particular, kind of came back to his roots, in these comics, and that's when we get all this incredible science fiction content. That we now associate, and people think of like the City of Kandor or all sorts of cool shit about Superman that's all cosmic and spacey and stuff like that. They associate all of that with like the golden age of comics, not realizing that actually came in much, much, much later. So basically, not only is the notion of this golden age of comics out of time. I mean, people are sort of saying, well, it must have been like that back in 1939, 1940, 1945. It's out of time. They're actually looking at 1956. And then it's also not particularly accurate in terms of content. In fact, it's deeply inaccurate. And it's such a brief little period that's being referenced or idealized. Now, why is 1971 important? 1971 is important because Captain Marvel, the guy in the big red suit, right, the guy who says Shazam, gets licensed to DC. So all of a sudden, the original dude, Superman, now has his imitator dude appeared, but notice that the imitator dude had actually originated most of the features that the original dude had adopted. So now the two of them are in the same company and they're trying to figure out what to do with this guy. And they basically say, okay, he's a kid's character. We're going to make him silly. We're going to make him fun. Superman, who is now being very humanized by Denny O'Neil in particular in the early 70s. And it's, they take away all sorts of the goofy stuff and rewrite Superman for, again, and he is turned into much more of this kind of thoughtful, semi-paternal sort of troubled godling, dude that has been established reinforced along the way since then. And that's happening. And then Captain Marvel gets to be this kind of, dude. He gets his fun TV show and it's very lighthearted and all the rest of it. It's kind of funny looking at that 70s TV show, which is quite lighthearted. And then go back and look at the Captain Marvel movies from the 40s where he like kills all these people to death like all the time. Well, anyway, the point here is that the story continues, but especially then we move into that period in the 80s. How does this myth get made? You see all those rabbit holes that I actually avoided several, having gone down one or two. How does the myth that John is referring to get made? Where now we have these metals that have very distinctive properties about the comics in each case. And I was cursing because somewhere in my blog and somewhere in my comics notes, which is not my big priority right now, there's the name of the Australian journalist who actually is the center of this promulgation. And if anybody can figure out who that is, please let me know, because I forgot his name. But that journalist basically punched home an article that was just incredibly influential and just soaked in. It's one of those discontinuous moments when everybody says what everybody knows, even though it was said for the first time, moments ago. Now, anything saying bam, pow, biff, comics finally grow up, those particular articles have been running along the history of comics for the entire period and are of no interesting, moment. But this time, there were several concomitant details. And one of them was that the Comics Code Authority was, although vaguely in existence, of no interest to anybody of any sort. The venue for selling comics had moved out of the newsstands. In 1981, it was still limping along when whatever newsstands or similar things like that were left. By 1986, they're gone. We now have the new animal, the comic book store. And distribution is different. Standards of ordering is different. The economics are different. Instead of, ripping the covers off and declaring them unsold as kind of the big weird tax dodge, now we have buyback and who holds the debt and all sorts of things that are associated with the 3-tier retail system. And that also has a lot to do with who owns those distributions and all the little dodgy things that happen due to that. Well, anyway, that whole new economic situation is there, and one of the details is that now the content of the comics can change. So you may be interested to know just how much cursing and just one hair out of visibility, sex and killing and stuff were involved all through the 70s. Starting pretty much actually in the late 60s and then moving into the 70s. And I'm happy to be, that's my zone. I'm happy to tell you all about, the superhero comics and associated horror, psychedelica, science fiction, and fantasy that is all mixed up with that, and politics and cosmic stuff and who knows what, pop psychology, all these things, in the ferment of the 70s. But they still had this kind of, one step off the, you had to read the dialogue and go, oh, that's what they're talking about. Or you have to say, did that dude just get thrown like off panel into the Doomsday Incinerator? I think he did. And then there's actually some on-screen deaths that are quite gruesome during that time on panel that people kind of forget about. But the point being that now we have much more explicit depictions. We have open cursing, which, like movies, kind of like grades up. They say shit, and then they look around and see whether lightning strikes, and it doesn't. And they go, oh, well, if I say shit and son of a bitch, I can. It takes a little bit for them to, you can see through the years, the comics company are kind of like seeing what they can do. Well, they can do anything movies can do sooner or later. And they're like, oh, we could do anything movies can do. What a shock. So that's occurring. And there's also a follow the leader kind of phenomenon going on when you have comics like The Dark Knight Returns comes out. And then all of a sudden you want to make all of your characters and stories and everything, do what The Dark Knight did. or do what Watchmen did. Watchmen came out just after The Dark Knight Returns, so it's easy for people to sort of confound those. Um, and I should also point out that a lot of the work by those very same creators was wretched. The Killing Joke is a terrible comic book. I mean, not because I don't approve of it, because I kind of don't, but that's neither here nor there. It's just a shitty story. It's not well done. It's beautifully illustrated. Whoopee. I'm a terrible comics book fan. I actually don't think it's beautiful or the art is great. Is actually, the tipping point. The point being that things were read into both The Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns, and then a bunch of this other stuff which is deemed good by association, or like it by association, either in art style or in the depiction of this or that, that completely overlooks several phenomena. One is the astonishing incoherence of the politics. And in this, I'll accept Alan Moore, who really had his political head on straight and was very clear on what he was talking about, and was, I venture to speculate, was baffled that nobody seemed to notice. And then you have just the blithering confusions of Frank Miller and Mike Grell and a bunch of other people who were just stumbling around in circles, not sure whether they were for freedom against the government, or freedom for, against the liberals, or freedom, for the businessman, or freedom for America, or whatever it was. I mean, they were just kind of stumbling around, trying to be free thinkers and spirits of, individual heroism at the same time as, falling apart, basically. And it's very, very Reagan era content. I won't even discuss. Well, you can go read the blog about everything that I and others discuss about the trajectory of the Punisher. All of these things are occurring, and so you can easily throw in the Punisher as undergoing a transformation at this period of suddenly, probably to the shock even of people like Mike Barron who were writing it, in many cases, while he's trying to be edgy, suddenly it turns into right-wing iconography, and it's not. I think it's probably just like twisted under the knife, even in the sense of what the actual creators were doing. So that a couple of years later, there he is running around doing what he's doing, and even the creators a couple of years ago would be saying, "What on earth? How did that happen?" But yet you can see it happening right there in their own stuff. So all of this is occurring. These are the concomitant details that accompany this excitement that, now you can see, titties in a comic book with superheroes, and that must mean we're all mature now. I have a lot to say about that. I actually think that there was a diminution of content for the most part. Not on an individual basis, because there are many of the creators who actually ramped up in terms of the quality of their content, in a variety of different companies and in a variety of different ways. Moore kept trying. You can kind of see, I imagine somebody could even track the degrees of despair and discontent and hopeful try again, that sort of maps Moore's trajectories through comics. But I think that there was a hysteria in the air, and this is a period in which I was hanging out. We're talking about the mid 80s through the mid 90s. This is a period in which I was literally hanging out with the pros, and not in I claim no understanding of how this happened, but I was not treated as a fanboy, and learned stuff and was included in stuff, and even in very professional circumstances. I mean, like, why am I even here? There's no one else here who isn't getting a paycheck, and I'm here. Why is this? And so I learned a great deal about seeing people struggle their way through talking about these things, the discourse was not necessarily clear or coherent. People were struggling with what makes a strong female character. People were struggling with what makes, when is this militarism what we do or don't want to do? And bear in mind, Gulf War I, 1991, played a huge role in all of this. So and comic book companies are, the ones who were up and coming and changing the whole industry, they were all melting down. And Marvel was undergoing ownership changes that turned what it did into confetti. So all through this period, there's the black and white boom. There are two black and white booms, the one in the late 80s and then the really muscly one, right, in the 90s. All of these things are occurring that in such a way that there is an expansion of content, or the expanded content is now more visible than it was before. And there was less of a clear distinction between newsstand stuff that subvert the comics code authority as it always did. Still, you flip through it and you would not see, naughty bits. Whereas, and if you wanted to, you could go into the comic book store and you could buy, in fact, Roberta Gregory's Naughty Bits, name of her comic, and buy it there. But the distinction was clear. By this point, it's not clear. The quality of the overlap, in my opinion, dropped sharply, and you get this weird, we're so edgy, but this is so bland thing that people think of as one of the dark ages of comics. So I don't know if I've really answered the question, but having sat actually inside some of it, and had the people who are actually making the comics, scratch their heads over, what on earth is going on? What do we do with Barbara Gordon? She got fridged, right? What are we going to do with this? And so the actual phenomenon of what occurred was infrastructural in its basics, and then concomitant with specific other things at work. And let's not forget what I'm always on about. Somehow in the early to mid 80s, there was a general rewriting of the cultural past. And you may not believe it now, but for a good 20, 25 years, the 70s did not exist. We didn't mention it. We didn't look at it. We mined from it. Everybody mined from it. The content was mined, and in fact, I could even point to The Watchmen as very much a celebration of many aspects of superhero groups from the 70s. But a big part of it was this notion, especially because a lot of the comics themselves adopted the myth and said, okay, so they were light and fun and funny and fast and cheesy and all that stuff in the past. So they, in their own fiction, would depict the past in that fiction as having been like that for the older superheroes. I actually think The Watchmen doesn't do that. The Watchmen actually is that, the 40s were as grim and gritty as the present. Although again, later iterations of The Watchmen have fallen into the trap. So I don't know if I got anywhere with this, but those are some of my takes on some of the issues, and I hope you at least found it, semi-interesting. And if you didn't, then you could have just fast forwarded through the part that says John's question and moving on.